Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Leading Edge. I'm Kate Cacciatore, Head of Sustainability at FigBytes, the sustainability data management platform that connects data with purpose. Before I introduce you to my guest today, here's some context about the purpose of this podcast series and some of the questions and themes it sets out to explore. As we face major global challenges such as the effects of climate change, water shortages, and biodiversity loss, in addition to social inequalities, conflict, and threats to food security, there is growing awareness today across all stakeholder groups that business, with its global clout, has to do more than incrementally improve its sustainability performance. The systemic changes that are needed to help us shift to a net positive, regenerative, inclusive economy and society are massive. They will require unprecedented collaborative efforts of the private and public sectors, of civil society and citizens to find new business and consumption models, innovative products and services, groundbreaking policies, financing mechanisms, and partnerships. This podcast invites business, sustainability, civil society, and public sector leaders to share their experience on the leading edge of the sustainability transition. What motivates them to act and innovate in this space? What is their vision and how are they working towards it? What have they learned about what works and what's holding us back? How do they stay strong and resilient when faced with adversity? And what kind of mindset shift do they think will be necessary to bring about the changes we want to see in the world? Today, for this third episode of the podcast, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sonja Haut, Head of Impact Valuation at the multinational pharmaceutical company Novartis, which has its headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. Sonja is the author of the new book, The Case for Impact, a guide to creating value in a world of social and environmental challenges, which has been described as a clarion call for the adoption of impact measurement and an essential guide for those who want to understand the importance of impact in staying ahead of the curve. Sonja's pioneering work in the practice of impact valuation is immensely valuable to the field of sustainability and to anyone seeking to learn about the state of the art when it comes to turning an organization's purpose and its desire for positive impact into reality. So Sonja, welcome and thank you for being my guest today on the podcast and exploring the leading edge of the sustainable transition with me.
Thanks, Kate, for having me. Such a pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. So I guess it would be lovely to start with a little bit of context about your role in Novartis and what impact valuation means.
Yeah, Novartis is a large pharmaceutical company headquartered in Basel, Switzerland, with around about 100,000 employees. And our fields of medicines cover cardiovascular disease, oncology, gene therapies. And the purpose of the company is really strong and engaging. It's about we're reimagining medicines to extend and improve people's lives. And I have the pleasure to head impact valuation there. It's a practice that started some 7.5 years back, and the role belongs to the accounting department.
Fantastic. I think what's interesting about your career journey is that compared to maybe some people who may have done sustainability throughout their career, you started in IT and finance, if I remember correctly. So I'm particularly interested to hear about the journey and how you discovered impact valuation. What led you to that? In particular, for anybody who might be in a finance role in a company and looking to see how they could also connect with the areas of sustainability and impact.
Yeah, indeed. IT were the starts. I'm a mathematician, and at the end of my studies, I had seen sufficient abstraction to have developed a want for something tangible and applicable. So the move into IT felt natural and into business. And within Novartis, I had worked with information flows and processes on one of their global projects early on, which brought me closer to finance. So by the time I had completed my MBA with IMD, I was mature to be adopted by group finance. So this is how that has come about. And then it was, if you wish, a topic of, well, allow me to say here, a coincidence that certain questions from the external world had just amassed to the extent that there were more and more inquiries on so-called non-financials that just translated to the question on what would that mean for the accounting department in charge of actually making sure that the actual reporting is compliant and robust and there on time, and how would we be dealing with such questions on non-financial. So, and at some point, the idea, out of a few ideas, that idea was born to pursue further that notion of measuring and valuing our impacts.
I guess at this early stage, this was several years ago, before the field of impact valuation matured and into what it has become today, which is quite significant. And so were you reaching around in the dark a little bit? Did you already have a sense of a definition of what impact meant in that context?
Yeah, that's right. And I think later editions now, or recent editions, are that impact is pretty much used as an PR term. Just makes people feel good about basically expressing that's roughly the right thing. But the practice of impact valuation comes with just very sobering ideas and definitions about differentiating metrics of impact from metrics of inputs and outputs, which are the dominant indicators in traditional financial reporting, but also in sustainability reporting, and then to possibly push it direction of outcomes for stakeholders or impact to stakeholders. And in the definition of the G7 Impact Task Force, basically trying to assess what really has changed in the well-being of stakeholders due to a business activity.
Yeah.
So while such a beautiful definition wasn't there from such a highly regarded institution at the G7 Impact Task Force that is now, the available methodologies, namely TIM by PwC and True Value by KPMG, pretty much had that at the heart of their of the way they worked.
Right. And I think I remember from some of the conversations we've had before that in your accounting role, with all the data points, the many data points of that are required of companies for ESG, I think you spoke about the fact that you can get a bit lost in all of those data points, and that the impact valuation, as you have practiced it and described it, is more about understanding some more fundamental aspects and sort of clarifying with a very strategic focus. Is that right? How would you describe impact valuation in terms of getting beyond those many fragmented data points to a more holistic view of how business operates in society?
Yeah, this is pretty much the intriguing part that in the end led me also to write that book, The Case for Impact, because I felt that this is so much more than what we originally thought it could possibly be, and it just deserves a wider audience. So, and I think the winning point to get the attention of business leaders for topics that are not classically viewed as business is really to actually have this unifying unit of measure.
Yeah.
Because we express our impacts in monetary terms, and this is very much the case for all the examples shown in the Case for Impact, demonstrating how business value is brought about through looking at the impacts of a company and expressing it in monetary terms, and thus engaging differently with stakeholders in all their varieties, with all their different areas of focus. And maybe zooming back, without doing that, just alone in the environmental space, you're confronted with a huge number of different units of measure, with tons of CO2 now being established and widely recognized, but of course tons of waste and water and blue, green, and gray water, and all of the other technical terms on toxicity. And it gets very soon very confusing. And actually, it's clear that each of these themes require not just one PhD, but a whole series of deep scientific knowledge. And so to cut through that and just enable business leaders to recognize the essentials for their decision making is pretty much the strong point of impact valuation.
Yeah, absolutely. If we go back to your journey in Novartis, and which is told beautifully in your book, and I really would encourage everyone to read the book, not just for the background and the understanding of how the impact movement has developed and how impact valuation methodologies have become close to, well, towards convergence and standardization, but also for the examples and the spirit with which, for example, in Novartis, you've explored this space. So it would be lovely to come back and talk a little bit more about how did this get started? Because I seem to remember that you, in the book, you present different approaches that companies could take, but you also share what happened with the exploratory path that you took in Novartis and how it wasn't necessarily top down. It was more bottom up or a sort of entrepreneurial approach. It'd be lovely to hear a bit more about how it all started and what the different sort of turns in the path you encountered in that journey.
Yeah, will do, or give an attempt at doing it.
Yeah.
So the starting point with the idea around impact valuation was really, could that possibly be an answer to better decisions that are more encompassing, and would that possibly be a basis for conversations with all stakeholders on a joint perspective on reality, and then would that possibly aggregate to disclosures as well? Could that possibly be an addition to current disclosure practices? So with these three objectives, we piloted the approach in two very different countries, in Kenya and in China. In Kenya, we had a substantial pre-business model philanthropic engagement that we were seeking to get to a self-sustaining social business level. And in China, we had full-fledged operations. And so that was also to test out where the idea would resonate more strongly, or what to do with such a tool should it ever work. So the first hurdle was, of course, the topic of feasibility. And once that was crossed out, it was really interesting to see how certain very practical elements on data availability in China allowed me to very quickly actually scale the approach for the entire company. So because it's been clear from my IT and finance roles that whatever it is I propose, it would never really work if it came with an additional reporting burden. So to the extent possible, that had to be designed in a way that it really uses central data pockets, centrally available data, and build on that. So that was the design principle, with the upside that once that worked, I could expand. So based on that expansion included visibility on the environmental supply chain. So for the first time, and very briefly, we had a view on the total environmental externalities, not only own operations, but really full supply chain. And that was quite an eye-opener, just to understand the order of magnitude of such things. And well, despite, of course, the happiness around feasibility on that transparency, the big question remained in that we had started actually with selecting indicators on what to pilot based on our materiality assessments, a practice that we had run since 2012. And the idea would have been to actually have a response to every material item and have like an impact indicator. What it turned out is that out of the existing practices at that time, there was very little to say on social impacts and social risks, and nothing really about the social impact of medicines. So it was clear that whatever, as happy as I could be that feasibility was a given and that scaling was possible, it was also clear that there were major content gaps. So what happened then over time was to scout for additional solutions and meaningful answers to a number of these gaps, while seeking to understand how, under which circumstances, the data points identified could be meaningful for business at Novartis.
Well, it sounds like an amazing journey. And it's interesting that you mentioned the materiality basis there, because it raises a question for me in terms of, which I'm sure will be in many people's minds, about impact as a discipline and a field, being both intimately related to sustainability, but also breaking with some aspects of sustainability or going further than that. Were you aware at the time? Were you thinking through the fact that, well, this is materiality and indicators, but we're definitely going further here? And how did that manifest in terms of the kinds of outcomes and impact that you were beginning to envisage with the internal and external stakeholders you were engaging with?
Not sure whether going further was so clear and evident, because our materiality assessment had been very broad and really supported by a great number of external stakeholders as well. So it really felt more like operationalizing this into metrics, into measures of success. But of course, other practices we had used were clear that they would feed into, but that actually the ambition of impact valuation would be much broader. So, but it was really at the beginning just the ambition, because we didn't have an answer on whether jobs created would be good jobs, or whether that environmental risk how that would compare to human rights violation risks in the supply chain, and whether there'd be anything to be said on the social impact of medicines. That was clearly the number one result throughout the materiality assessments consistently, and actually in line with the company's purpose, and in line with the key priority areas for sustainability, on focusing on access and innovation. So that felt like a huge gap for impact valuation as a practice to qualify, if you wish.
Yes, I guess that's also connecting to a point that you make in very effectively in the book about ESG can often be seen from the perspective of risks and being more aware of risks, whereas impact just puts a lot more emphasis, in addition to risks, on the opportunities, the business opportunities, and making that connection. And it strikes me also that in the book you make that connection very much with the purpose of the organization, and you use a few examples of that to get across the importance of explicitly making a connection between the company's purpose and some of these business opportunities and impacts that are sought. In the case of Novartis, it's in the area of social impact of medicine, among many others, I think. How would you describe that connection between purpose then and impact?
Still along the journey, these connection points weren't evident initially, and so it was really initially just about making sure that this is robust and works, and that everything can be scaled and the gaps closed. But then once these methodological gaps were sufficiently addressed, a larger pattern started to emerge. So in parallel, we started to see a number of use cases across the globe, and then all of a sudden we started to have also an aggregate view that was fairly complete. So now that brought about the next question on how to interpret that on a aggregate level for the entire company. And there's this intriguing paper by a number of high-ranking academics from both sides of the Atlantic on the topic of how to measure purpose and what the role is of metrics of value and success. And this paper on measuring purpose identifies impact as the ultimate goal for metrics of success towards companies enacting their purpose or seeking to strive towards their purpose. And I think a lot more needs to be said and researched and done, but clearly that felt as one possible interpretation of these results to say, well, this is an expression on how well a company fares on enacting its purpose, and should become a yardstick for how to possibly further improve or set itself ambitious targets to go beyond what's already there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what's connected to what you've just said, and which is very significant, is the convergence also with the different kinds of capitals that are now being expressed. I guess it's a concept of thinking in terms of not just physical and financial capital, but social, natural, and what am I missing? Well, the environmental, obviously, the different capitals. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the context of the Capitals Coalition and the different protocols that have emerged as a framework to support the work of impact practitioners such as yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Conceptual response and the practitioner's response. On the conceptual side, the issuance of the Natural Capital Protocol helped, of course, to give credibility to the environmental impact side of our work. And then later, as the social and human capital came about, we made sure that on the wording side, and for all the principles put out by the Capitals Coalition, would stay aligned with that. At the same time, one cannot possibly think back, but the notion of UN SDGs wasn't that widespread at that point in time. So when we started off with impact valuation in 2015, they weren't issued yet. But at the same time, certain elements of thinking around capitals that are non-financial, that thinking had taken hold. And intriguingly, one of my colleagues in the role of a country CFO picked that up and wanted to use this framing actually to introduce a new country president. And actually, he was sort of challenging me on whether the data I had on his country could be used in that spirit, and what was missing basically, and how, whether that could be validated by the leading national think tank to actually get that contextualized. And I found this super powerful, and we started to actually call the entire activity a co-creation, because this is pretty much what was necessary. I admit I hadn't dared to propose to frame the entire impact valuation work that we called social, environmental, and economic impact valuation, pretty much sober along what it is, and no marketing name around it. But I wouldn't have dared to give it that framing. And it was really with that country CFO running with this and actually framing it that way, that was one option of expressing that, an example that Marco said, and that was later followed by others. So not everything that we see now was of course evident at the beginning, but I think the power of the impact valuation approach is that we can say it's been field tested through different lenses across the globe in different variants, and with different areas of emphasis. So I do continue to believe in its transformatory power.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's extremely helpful. And I think I want to come back to the question of the process internally in Novartis, because I'm sure a lot of companies will be wondering, well, how do I start? What do I do? And you might have some suggestions or some ideas based on your experience, very practically, because one of the things that you mentioned was that the notion of stakeholder capitalism and the triple bottom line, these are notions that have been around for a really long time. There's nothing particularly new about them. But what is new about impact valuation is that it puts the very practical managerial tools into people's hands to be able to do something about it. So I'm putting those two things together, sort of giving some practical advice, which you do very well in the book, about how to operationalize this. and reminding people that this is something actually it's just fundamentally strategic and it's common sense for business. Perhaps you could share a few examples of what that was like in practice and what kinds of things you did together in that co-creation.
Yeah, will do, Kate. So yes, I mean, inevitably, because we were so early at Novartis, this had to be an exploratory activity that was, of course, supported by the company, but without calling it out as the number one or so sustainability activity. It was exploratory. So by nature, we had to go a bit with the flow of what's required and what resonated and evolve around that. But I think with that done and with feasibility proven now in the meantime, also by the practitioners that have come together in the Value Balancing Alliance, there's no need anymore to actually go down this long-winded path of exploration. So any company that wants to go and hits the point straight, there could be just that very practical approach of utilizing the published methodologies by the Value Balancing Alliance and the papers that Novartis and others have put out to just get to the impact results really, really, really quickly, and then get into the heart of the matter, which is debriefing, interpreting, and drawing conclusions on what the actions need to be on the way forward. You can come at this, of course, as well from as a result of a strategy exercise, and here it really depends on what the strategic appetite is. But if one was to truly scout for mega trends and their implications on the business model, I do believe at some point you'd want to know how to actually measure progress versus strategic goals. And my conviction it is that at this point in time, impact metrics are useful again. So it really depends on where you want to start, how much of a strategic impetus there is. But with the book, with the case for impact, I've assembled examples that show how companies were capable of driving their top line growth, of driving their bottom line growth, and engaging effectively with stakeholders, that I believe one doesn't even need an overarching drive to do that. It just makes good business sense. And I think that in itself is inherent motivation enough to go after measured impacts.
And what's your sense about the availability of the data from, whether it's the social, economic, or environmental aspects that you're looking at in this exercise? Is the data available for these kinds of calculations? Do you need to have all the data in advance, or can you interpret and make sense of the data even if it's incomplete?
Yeah, super good point. Good that we touch on that, as I missed to comment on that earlier. Yes, impact transparency is possible. And to me, the greatest breakthrough of the year has been really with the WIFO Institute utilizing our Value Balancing Alliance methodology to provide transparency on a sector in Germany on their supply chain impacts. And this has been kind of impressive intellectually, but ever so disruptive if you think about the options this means. This comes with for investors, for governments, for anyone who wants to understand the social, environmental, and economic impact of a sector much better. So this has proven that data is sufficiently available. Is it perfect? Certainly not. Nothing is perfect, but existing statistics give us enough insights to get going. Now, within companies, I know that data can be organized very differently and that things may not always be as straightforward. At the same time, convinced that, well, any company that has some need for effective steering, be it for their own operational needs, be it for tax purposes, be it for disclosure purposes, will have the required data points available to at least have a meaningful starting point. And then it's just a matter of how massive do assumptions have to be to come to a complete picture? Where is it that you can actually use with direct data and where is it that you have to derive that. But feasibility is absolutely given.
Okay, that's really helpful. And as we were discussing earlier today as well in our conversation, it's not just the data and what the data says, it's the process of interpreting that data both internally and with the stakeholders. And I think you emphasize this point in the early chapters of your book about trust and having a common language with the stakeholders who are involved to kind of understand it's not just the business perspective on what's relevant, but it's understanding those stakeholders' perspective on what matters to them in that process. Am I right in thinking that it's again a co-creation with those stakeholders about what matters and ultimately what kinds of impacts should be sought and improved?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the starting point to engage internally and externally is to have impact transparency. And once that's there, one can start to think about how to go about interpreting it and what the next steps would be, and what implications it would come with if one was to improve the current impact situation, that is reducing the negative and furthering the positive. And the question is really, what does good look like and what should be a meaningful benchmark for success? And here I believe this is where the role of stakeholders comes in. In my mind, it's hard for a company to actually articulate this in and by itself. So instead, by engaging with stakeholders, you will hear which type of performance they expect from you, also in terms of impact. And also I believe with a transparent invitation, as we used it for the materiality assessments, but also in a number of multi-stakeholder debriefings on the impact results, it's super helpful to understand what everybody wants a company to do, and not all expectations are uniformly aligned. So that's also helpful to understand what can be synthesized in a direct action plan, and what is it where certain stakeholders maybe need to find different paths to getting to their goals, and where the limits are of what a company can meaningfully do. But I think to explore that in an open manner and based on an invitation and based on, I'd like to call it a joint perspective on shared facts, that's just a strong starting point. And then one can, of course, disagree. One can look for different starting points. One can emphasize other aspects, but at least there's a starting point for a dialogue, which I believe is super important. It's just super important since you said in your entry that this podcast is also about having meaningful contributions for civil society debates and for governmental debates, and I think that's pretty much the essence of you need inputs for these debates, and what should they be, and can we find common grounds of such a debate?
So interesting. And it makes me think also about, we're obviously seeing out of all that fragmentation and proliferation of data and different data points, we are seeing a convergence in terms of, having common frameworks, common standards, and even common sets of metrics around certain sectors. So I'm curious to know what you think about how this momentum in the impact valuation field is going to meet up with this convergence in the sort of sustainability disclosure frameworks and standards. So, for example, the work of the ISSB. Can we imagine in the future that the common sets of metrics that might emerge from this kind of work on both sides, from the ISSB perspective and also from the work of impact valuation practitioners, what might we see in the future?
Well, that would be ideal, right? That prospectively the ISSB and other regulator standard setters embed impact thinking in what it is they ask from companies. And the reason why I would hope such a future comes true is because I see that is a path whereby the interests of business can nicely match those of what's required from society to the extent that is articulated through these regulations. And I believe that's important in order for regulations not to digress to a tick boxing exercise for companies whereby data points are asked that are just don't have a deep meaning internally. And with with my experience in financial reporting, I just think it's best when these worlds converge, when what's required externally also makes sense internally, and then you get to yardsticks of progress, success, performance that are truly understood the same way by the company itself and by its external stakeholders. So to me, this would be the ideal scenario. It's a few years out though.
Yeah, but I think we feel it, right? We feel it. I felt it for several years, and the signals are there. There's so many initiatives to the point that these acronyms of different organizations become a bit mind-boggling, but it's all happening, and there's a lot to learn. And you have provided many resources in your book, and also on the Novartis website, there's a link which we'll share in the text related to this podcast, where people can find the use cases. And if we just go back there for a minute to sort of talk about where Novartis is today, having gone through this exercise. If I understand correctly, there are many applications of impact valuation, from sort of micro level to the country level, to understanding in monetary terms how the social, environmental, and economic impacts of a country strategy, for example, are playing out, and what that means to the future of the strategy and decisions that might be taken. So that's one aspect. And then on the other aspect, there's the aggregated company view in a sort of integrated annual report perspective, where again you have these monetary expressions of the value created, both in terms of the negative and positive impact. Perhaps you could just share a few words about where Novartis is today in that respect, and where you see things moving in the future.
Yeah, where Novartis is at. Well, the resource that you mentioned on the virtual exhibition under cci-summit.com contains external trends, reference points, but also the published use cases that Novartis has with impact valuation. So these use cases are quite numerous in the meantime. So they're well over 70. More, of course, exist that are not published. So here, that gives a bit an indication for the different flavors of use cases. But then, and that will undoubtedly continue. I believe we've done more than scratching the surface, but there's clearly more potential that is not yet harvested, if I can say it that way. But then that's of course different to a view of corporate reporting, which is driven by the needs of staying compliant and having a report that appeals to stakeholders that are predominantly shareholders. So that is almost a different dynamic there. So for the past 4 years, the total impact valuation results have been part of the web page disclosure of annual reports, as well as part of that suite, and we'll see how that continues. But it's almost like a different world, whereby the drivers are not immediate links to those non-shareholder type stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what I take away from what you've written in the book and what I've learned from you just talking together is that what's most important is the forward-looking intentions, and what we can learn from the data and from the figures that the impact valuation offers, in terms of thinking about, okay, what decision will we take in the future? How might we change our strategy as a result of what we have learned? I think that's a very powerful element of impact valuation and the work that you've been doing, and it really speaks to that transformational potential that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, in a recent conversation on the ABC of impact investing, that has been named the essence that impact is forward looking instead of just backward looking. And I think the key thing is exactly as you said about how to debrief on these impact statements, and their nature is just so much more encompassing than other types of ESG indicators that often fail to connect to a bigger picture. And I think that's the biggest asset of impact valuation, that it helps get a simple story across without overly simplifying. And I think based on that, if there can be interest in what that bigger story is, then it's possible to engage with people in an non-moralizing, but in an engaging, empowering way that invites people to think about what these figures mean and what their contribution is and what it is they can do day in and out to actually maximize impact. And then once one is at that point of the conversation, there's of course a multiplication of opportunities on which measures to take, in view that, well, it needs to make good business sense, right? But it becomes then an optimization problem whereby you have more parameters known, and so it's not surprising that along the journey, a number of our colleagues have then challenged me and my team to say, well, okay, now that we know past performance, give us our forecast. We want to know where we'd end. Should we continue business as usual, and can you give us a sense for which are the largest levers? So these are all, but these types of questions and challenges and conversations are enabled by basically providing a starting point, which is a statement of transparency of what the impact of a company or part of the company is on society. And then from there on, one can engage in conversations of what that means, what can be optimized, and what the implications of that are.
Exactly. Yeah. And as you were speaking there, I was just imagining, I know that companies are already thinking in these terms about being able to visualize the scenarios, the different scenarios, and the different decisions that a company can take to travel along the path of one or other of those scenarios, and how, you know, technology today is helping us to be able to visualize not just net zero pathways, but perhaps in the future, what if we make this change to the product? What would happen as a result, and how could we integrate this perspective of a stakeholder group over here that we've been hearing from into how we might do things differently. So I think that's a very exciting aspect of how impact valuation is going to contribute to making things more real and immediate and tangible for practitioners.
Exactly. To me, this empowering aspect is really the strongest point in get people to think by themselves. Nothing would be possible clearly with just one person thinking along these lines, or with one team proposing certain ideas. I think the more this can be supported by broader groups who bring in their own expertise, their own skill sets, their own ingenuity to the challenges that lie ahead, the better. So this empowering aspect is really one that is one of the key strengths, I believe.
Wonderful.
That impact valuation reveals.
Yes. And is there anything that you'd like to share in terms of your vision for the future? I think you've shared quite a lot about that, but anything else that you would like to add, either in terms of your vision for the future, and also any advice that you might share with companies who are wishing to go down this path at this point?
Let me start with the second first. Any company who's interested in making sense of the currently super confusing world is well advised to actually engage in impact valuation and just get their heads around what impact their business activities has. And that's a great yardstick towards innovation, towards helping them remain relevant in that world of increasing complexity and challenges. My vision and hope for our collective future goes beyond that. I would hope that with impact applied by businesses and governments and investors, we could really move to something that some have called an impact economy, whereby performance value success, not only of businesses, but also of nations, is expressed in impact terms. And that way we have a something like a consistency to in the same extent as we currently have it between financial performance and national performance as expressed in GDP terms. So, and I believe that would help us align on what it is that we want to achieve, that we have to achieve short term, and would also help us allocate collectively resources and capital in the best way. But well, since you asked for my vision, this is it.
I love that vision, and I share it myself as well. And I think that it's a very exciting time to be working in this field, and for people in finance, in IT, in sustainability, in any function in a company or outside a company to be contributing to this area. So I'd just like to thank you again for joining me today and sharing with us your expertise and your journey. And I'm going to be going back and looking over all the notes I've taken from your book to really take away all the lessons that it and the resources that it offers. So I hope others will do the same. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks, Kate, for having me today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.